Will infrastructure expenditure make the future brighter? The 2014 budget speech coverage is brought to you by Old Mutual Corporate.
In just over 2 months, we will again exercise our most fundamental expression of freedom, our right to vote for a new government. Political emancipation, however, is just the beginning of our journey towards justice and equality. In exercising the responsibilities that flow from democratic participation, we have the opportunity to create a better future for all. As Madiba wrote on his prison calendar in 1979, and I quote, "The purpose of freedom is to create it for others," end of quote. At the outset, I want to thank all South Africans for their support, cooperation, and encouragement to all of us. Ngiyabonga, India Livua, Enkosi, Kea Leboga. Good lessons. We have achieved much over the past 5 years in a very difficult post-recession climate. But there is more to do ahead, more to build, more to put right, more to learn, and more to implement. We can only do this together. Fellow South Africans, let me be frank with you. The world economy is still in difficulty. The global institutions are struggling to find their way. In South Africa, we stabilized our economy after the 2008 crisis. We have achieved a recovery in growth and jobs, yet we need to do more, together with labor, business, and all stakeholders, to lead our economy to a new, bold direction for higher growth, decent work, and greater equality. Mr. President, you said in your reply to the State of the Nation debate, and I quote, "20 years of freedom and democracy have changed the face of our country. The last 5 years have further advanced change and a better life for all, especially the poor and the working class," end of quote. An agenda for transformation would include our plans for the period ahead, which are focused on the transformation imperatives that will accelerate growth, create work opportunities, and build a more equal society. This budget lays the foundation for the structural reforms envisaged over the next term of this government. It sets out the resource plan for an intensified implementation of our National Development Plan. It is tabled in the knowledge that all South Africans will gain from our economic transformation, just as we all share in a new pride and identity under our constitutional democracy. So the new economic order we seek cannot just be a pact amongst elites, a coalition among stakeholders with vested interests, nor can it be built on populist slogans or unrealistic promises. Our history tells us that progress has to be built on a vision and strategy shared by leaders and the people, a vision founded on realism and evidence. We have to work together to radically change our economy. This means working with our major businesses so that they sparkle across the globe. It means working with Black entrepreneurs to grow their companies across South Africa and beyond, working with small and large businesses to build value chain linkages that support dynamic, export-orientated, competitive enterprises. It means bringing those who are marginalized into the mainstream of opportunity and activity. It means a better standard of living for all our people. Whether you are employed or unemployed, a young person caring for a family, yet still going to school, someone looking for experience in order to move to a better job, or looking for skills or needing further education opportunities, or working in a government employment program or a temporary construction project. Whether you are an unskilled worker or a young professional looking for opportunities to develop specialist experience, we can together move forward towards a better life for all. It is time for a bold vision of our future as set out in the National Development Plan. It is time for action and implementation. It is time to move South Africa forward to the next stage of our historic journey to more rapid growth, jobs, and development. It is time to leave behind poverty, joblessness, and inequality. The overview of our 2014 budget, Mr. Speaker, indicates the following. The economy, as far as the economy is concerned, the global economic outlook remains unsteady. Some advanced economies have returned to some growth, others continue to lag. The slowdown in quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve of the US has caused further uncertainty to financial markets, currency volatility, and capital flows from emerging markets. South Africa's economy has continued to grow, but more slowly than projected a year ago. We expect growth of 2.7% this year. A weaker exchange rate is a risk to the inflation outlook, but it supports exporters. Sustained improvements in competitiveness require further investment in infrastructure and a range of macroeconomic reforms. As far as the budget framework is concerned, despite slower economic growth, the 2013-14 budget deficit is projected to be 4% of GDP, lower than projected in October. The deficit will narrow to 2.8% of GDP over the medium term, and the net debt will stabilize at about 45% of GDP in 2016-17. Consolidated non-interest spending will amount to 1.1 trillion rands in 14-15, growing through 1.3 trillion rands in 2016-17, increasing about 2% in real terms over the medium term. National government departments are allocated approximately 48% of available funds, provinces 43%, and municipalities 9%. Capital spending is the fastest growing component of expenditure and is set to exceed inflation by over 4% a year. This is a very important fact, ladies and gentlemen, that we've now turned the budget around to the point where we're not just spending on consumption, we're also spending on capital investments. What are the benefits to households? The budget provides 9.3 billion rands in income tax relief to households, which includes you, of course. We'll come back to whether there are tax increases or not a little bit later. Government will expand its employment programs over the next 3 years and continue to support job creation by the private sector. We will build 216,000 houses and connect 905,000 households to electricity over this 3-year MTEF period. The number of children receiving the child support grant will increase to 11.4 million. 433 schools will be built. As far as support for businesses is concerned, increased support and tax relief for entrepreneurs and small businesses is proposed. Incentives for industry are strengthened, including funding for special economic zones. Nearly 500,000 subsistence and smallholder farmers will receive training and financial support from the budget. An important step for individuals in South Africa is the new financial security that we are attempting to create for them. Further steps will be taken to make sure that each of us, including our public, have a secure income in retirement. Unnecessary costs in the system will be cut. Your administration, Mr. President, started out with an economy that in rugby terms, and I must confess I don't play rugby, might be called a hospital pass. We experienced a once-in-70-year economic earthquake, something that 5 years later we all seem to have a sudden amnesia about, the aftershocks of which are not yet over. Today, we can report to the South African people on what we have done in the past 5 years to respond to this crisis. We began on a firm footing, growth of 5% a year between 2003 and 2008, a steady expansion in employment, a budget surplus for the first time in 50 years, Minister Manuel's hard work. We were set back by the crisis as well. a collapse in commodity prices, sharp declines in international trade, and a crisis in financial markets. The South African economy contracted by 1.5% in 2009. Nearly 1 million jobs were lost, and government revenue in 2009-10, when this administration came into office, fell short of the budget target by 61 billion rands. We stabilized this economy and ensured a recovery. Our response was to implement an aggressive counter-cyclical fiscal adjustment. When global trade went into reverse, we took the steps to improve competitiveness of businesses within the framework of the Industrial Policy Action Plan. We accelerated infrastructure investment, and we expanded financial assistance to businesses in distress at that time. We expanded the community works programs. Unemployment insurance and our expanding social grant program provided increased income support to the most vulnerable in our society. Our response to the global crisis was founded on a collectively agreed framework for working together, government, business, labor, and communities, facilitated by the National Economic Development and Labor Council, or NEDLAC, as we now know it. And so, although the great waves of financial turbulence and the slow growth in developed economies have constrained our economic recovery, we have recorded positive growth since 2010. We have more than recovered the jobs that were lost, and we have initiated a coordinated infrastructure investment program. It is organized into 17 strategic integrated projects, or SIPs, to catalyze opportunities in mining, in industry, agriculture, and services across the country. We have saved this country from the worst impact of the Great Recession, and all of us as South Africans should be congratulated on that. But having done well, what next? Our task never stops. Mr. President, in 1987, ANC President Oliver Tambo said the following, and I quote, "South Africa today is a country of immense inequalities. The bedrock of our perspective is our commitment to the establishment of democracy in a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it, black and white. In keeping with this commitment to our people, our policy positions enshrined in the Freedom Charter have been formulated with the fullest participation of our people," end of quote. Fellow South Africans, I can share with you that both government and the ruling party, the ANC, have reviewed the successes of the past 20 years, understanding, frankly, our weaknesses and strengths, and reflected on how best we can lead this country and all of our people to a better and more dynamic future. Mr. Speaker, no one in this House can deny that South Africa is a different country from the one this House and this government inherited in 1994. We have made immense strides in rebuilding a fragmented society and in opening opportunities for all South Africans. Yet we still have an immense set of tasks and challenges facing us. We cannot just muddle through the next decade, and that is our challenge. In fulfilling our aspirations in the Freedom Charter, we have a clear and comprehensive vision for South Africa in 2030, a plan for higher growth, decent work, and greater equality in the National Development Plan. As the first phase of implementing that vision, we have a 5-year plan and a medium-term budget framework so that step by step we can make a difference in the lives of all South Africans. On these two foundations, we are able to offer bold and forthright leadership. The next government will set out the details of its plans to deliver on the NDP after it takes office later in May. But let me first explain what I mean. The National Development Plan, as I already indicated, this administration has prepared it under the leadership of President Zuma, drawing on expertise and advice from South Africans of all walks of life. The NDP reflects the priorities underpinning this budget and prepares the ground for the next phase of our economic and social transformation. Central to the NDP, Mr. Speaker, is our commitment to partnership, to a social compact to reduce poverty and inequality and raise employment and investment. As I've said on many occasions from this platform, none of us can do it alone. To make more rapid progress in creating jobs and reducing poverty, We have to grow our economy at 5% a year or more, and I think all of us acknowledge that. To achieve this and to establish a growth path that is inclusive and rapidly promotes black economic development, a wide range of initiatives are underway. The accelerated public infrastructure investment I mentioned earlier, new spatial plans for cities in order that we don't continue to build on the apartheid city framework, improve public transport and upgrading of informal settlements, support for special economic zones and manufacturing incentives in the IPAP I referred to earlier as well, a tax incentive to encourage youth employment and more general employment in the SEZs, and further expansion of public works programs. A renewed focus on accountability and quality in education, phasing in of the National Health Insurance Scheme, further investment in renewable energy, and support for the transition to a low-carbon economy as we've committed to ourselves and the world. Steps to professionalize the public service and overhaul procurement and supply chain management in government. Yet, colleagues, I need to caution that success in implementing these plans depends on discipline, hard work, cooperation, and sustained improvements in productivity, both in the public and in the private sectors. Our present circumstances oblige us to live and spend modestly and keep a careful balance between social expenditure and support for growth. It's not an either-or question. And so in framing the 2014 budget, Mr. Speaker, we have reprioritized expenditure within the overall ceiling set in the October medium-term budget policy statement. The budget deficit will steadily decline over the period ahead. Mr. President, the next administration will inherit sound public finances, a platform for implementation of the NDP, and a framework for collaboration with all stakeholders in driving social and economic transformation forward. What are some of our government expenditure programs? And let me indicate some of them by way of example. Government has spent more than 100 billion rands on employment programs over the past 5 years, including municipal and provincial spending. More than 4 billion job opportunities were funded over this time. Allocations will continue to grow strongly, and 6 million job opportunities will be created over the next 5 years. We have spent 115 billion rands on higher education over the past 5 years, including 18.6 billion rands on the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. Allocations to NSFAS amount to 19.4 billion rands over the next 3 years and will assist over 500,000 students a year. We have spent 41 billion rands on HIV and AIDS programs over the past 5 years. And 43.5 billion rands is budgeted over the next 3 years. We have spent 39 billion rands on 1,879 hospital and other health facility projects. And 26 billion rands is allocated over the medium-term period ahead. Spending on social assistance has risen from 75 billion rands in 2008-9 to 118 billion rands this year. The number of grant recipients has increased from 13.1 million in 2009 to 15.8 million today. Spending on police services will increase from 74 billion this year to 88 billion rands by 2016-17. Police services will be more accessible through infrastructure development, rural safety strategies will be implemented, and the Family Child and Offences Unit will be strengthened. Spending on infrastructure amounted to 1 trillion rands over the past 5 years and will be 847 billion rands over the next 3 years. Spending on human settlement programs amount to 70 billion rands over the last 5 years, contributing to 590,000 houses being built. 850,000 households were connected to electricity over this period. Spending on industrial incentives amounted to 22 billion rands over the past 5 years. 21.8 billion rands is budgeted for in this MTEF period. 128 projects have been approved under the Automotive Investment Scheme, and more than 460 companies have benefited from the Clothing and Textiles Competitiveness Program. The spending plans contained in the 2014 budget build on this administration's progress since 2009. Reprioritization of resources aims to give greater impetus to programs with the greatest developmental impact and proven implementation capacity. So, where implementation is slow, we will take that money and use it where implementation is fast. The estimates of national expenditure provide detailed information on government spending plans over the year ahead. Honourable members, we know that job creation is a central priority of the National Development Plan, and indeed for all of us. Bantu bakuti, masibambisane, sake amatuba emisabenzi. Meaning, fellow South Africans, let us work together to create opportunities for employment. Since the low point of the 2009 recession, employment has increased by approximately 1.3 million, as recorded in the quarterly labor force survey. But unemployment of 24% of the workforce is still far too high. And so one of our respondents to, or suppliers of the tip, is Seppo Sechele, a student at Vaal University of Technology, and quite rightly advises that, and I quote, "The government should have clear strategies for youth development and employment for the next 5 to 20 years," end of quote. We have such a strategy. It includes, amongst others, stepped-up implementation of the expanded public works program, implementation of the community works program in every municipality by 2017, introduction this year of the youth employment or the tax incentive, which in its first month alone has recorded 56,000 beneficiaries. Establishment of special economic zones, industrial incentives, and support for agriculture and labor-intensive sectors. Ramping up skills development and further education and training programs. Housing investment, support for small and medium enterprises, and the Jobs Fund partnerships with the private and public sector development agencies. Billions of rands have been allocated to these programs. And to support those who lose their jobs in difficult times, Minister Oliphant has introduced proposals to extend unemployment benefits from 238 days to 365 days, on condition that claimants are actively seeking work. So some of the statistics we are giving, Mr. President, are actually proving in numbers and actual money that over the last 5 years of this administration's term of office, tremendous work was done that can be proved with numbers by this administration. The number of people eligible for grants is due to reach 16.5 million by 2016-17. The recent re-registration of grant recipients and the introduction of a new payment system have lowered the cost of administration, and I'm sure we can lower it even further. 1 million invalid beneficiaries were removed from the system, thanks to Minister Dlamini and her team. Social grants are meant for those who need them most, so we don't need passengers on this train. Grant recipients will receive the following increases this year. This is something that our older people are certainly looking forward to. The old age and disability grants will increase in April from 1,270 a month to 1,350 a month. The foster care grant will increase from 800 rands to 830 rands. And the child support grant will increase from 300 rands to 310 rands in April and to 320 rands in October. This administration has also launched a far-reaching reform to make quality health care affordable to all South Africans. Minister Motsoaledi, of course, is our singular champion. The Department of Health's white paper on the National Health Insurance and a financing paper by the National Treasury have been completed and will be tabled in Cabinet shortly. The unfolding of NHI is premised on two pillars being put in place. Improvements, on the one hand, have to be made in the public sector health delivery, and on the other hand, the high cost of private health care has to be reduced. This approach is supported by the World Health Organization. NHI pilot districts have been established in every province, supported by funding for NHI as a conditional grant. In addition to hospital and clinic building and refurbishing programs, 1.2 billion rands has been allocated for piloting general practitioners' contracts. An Office of Health Standards Compliance has been established to ensure that public health care provision meets the required standards. A new funding framework for the National Health Laboratory Services and associated research activities has also been agreed upon. But the improvements to this country's health system over the past 5 years are best seen in our rising life expectancy, as the President pointed out, the reduction in infant, child, and maternal mortality, and the changed lives of 2.5 million people who now have access to antiretroviral treatment. I think we should applaud all the health workers in our country. Over the period ahead, enrollment in HIV treatment programs will expand by about 500,000 a year. What about education? We've also made strides in improving access to education over the past 5 years. In 2007, 5 million learners had access to free education. This year, the number increased to 8.8 million. Grade R enrollment has increased from 544,000 in 2009 to 779,000 this year. The National School Nutrition Program now feeds 8.7 million children in our country. The Funza Lushaka bursary scheme supported 3,950 graduates qualifying for placement as teachers in 2013. Through the National Education Collaboration Trust, government, business, labor, and civil society will pool resources and work together to restore schools and improve education outcomes in the period ahead. The allocation to the National Student Financial Aid Scheme increases from 5.1 billion last year to 6.6 billion in 2016-17. I know Minister Nzimande wants a bit more, but we're working on it. This will increase the number of FET college bursaries to 292,000 and will assist over 236,000 students to attend university by 2016-17. As is emphasized in the NDP, improvements in education are critical. Darshan Shivambu, this is the other Shivambu, from Polokwane, was one of many who wrote to me in support of Minister Nzimande's plans, and I quote, "I would like you to put more money on the table for higher education, as more funding is required," end of quote. I'm not sure if Minister Nzimande paid him a fee for that. So the 2014 budget again gives special priority to education. As far as infrastructure investment is concerned, Mr. President, under your leadership of the Presidential Infrastructure Coordination Commission, coordinated by Minister Patel's department, we are now making progress in overcoming infrastructure backlogs and investing for more inclusive growth and development. Public infrastructure investment will amount to 847 billion rands over the next 3 years. The first unit of the Medupi power station is expected to be completed towards the end of this year. Transnet has increased capacity on its coal line. Plans are in place to further expand the coal, iron ore, and manganese lines. The Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa refurbished 500 metro rail coaches last year, and its new rolling stock procurement program will get underway this year, and I'll come back to this a little later. Spending on social infrastructure, which includes health, education, and community facilities, will increase from 30 billion rands in 2012-13 to 43 billion rands in 2016-17. Priority will be given to programs to eradicate school infrastructure backlogs and to refurbish clinics and hospitals. A program to rehabilitate 35 dams has been completed, and work is in progress on the country's 5 large water transfer schemes. In 2014-15, a total of 40 billion rands in infrastructure grants will be transferred to local government for their water, sanitation, energy, and environmental functions. The private sector, go ahead, do it properly. We need to wake each other up a little bit, you see. The private sector is also making an increasing contribution to infrastructure investment. Contracts for 47 renewable energy projects were concluded in 2012 and 2013, many of which are already under construction. These will add 2,460 megawatts of power capacity and an investment of 70 billion rands, which excludes a further 45 billion rands in investment that will still be contracted this year. Unlocking city development and municipal service delivery is another priority. Our development plans also focus on overcoming the spatial fragmentation of South Africa's built environment, the places where our people live. Improve public transport and accelerated investment in human settlements. An integrated city development grant has been introduced to strengthen long-term city planning and encourage private investment in urban development. It will amount to 814 million rands over the medium term. The assignment this year of the human settlements function to metropolitan municipalities by Minister September is a vital intervention in accelerating housing investment and integrated urban development. Over the next 3 years, national government will allocate 105 billion rands to municipalities for free basic water, sanitation, electricity, and refuse removal services and their improvement. In rural districts, Minister Nkwenti's development initiatives are gaining momentum and water supply and sanitation programs are in progress. 3.9 billion rands has been allocated to capacity building programs over the MTEF, targeted at small towns and rural municipalities. Billions of rands are allocated for special initiatives, and these include conditional grants to municipalities, support for the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agency, human settlements upgrading, support program in 53 municipalities that are struggling, managing the human settlements function, and settlement upgrading in mining towns, which is quite an important task that we have. Measures to promote economic growth are some of the following, Mr. Speaker. Our policy is one of inclusive growth, not of excluding the majority in our country. In the words of the NDP, to strengthen, and I quote, the virtuous cycle of growth and development, end of quote. Over the medium term, several spending plans and tax measures are aimed at addressing structural economic challenges and promoting the stronger and more inclusive growth envisaged in the NDP. Manufacturing development initiatives are allocated 10.3 billion rands over the next 3 years, in addition to tax relief offered through various incentive programs. The economic competitiveness and support programs will provide 15.2 billion rands to businesses to upgrade machinery and increase productivity over the MTEF period. Special economic zones are allocated 3.6 billion rands to promote value-added exports and generate jobs in economically disadvantaged parts of the country. In support of the digital broadcast migration program, 620 million rands will be allocated in the adjustments appropriation this year from funds to be surrendered to the National Revenue Fund by Centec. Government is developing an agricultural policy action plan to support the NDP's target of creating 1 million jobs in agriculture and land reform by 2030. Over 7 billion rands will be spent on conditional grants to provinces to support about 435,000 subsistence and 54,000 smallholder farmers and to improve extension services. These are concrete bits of help to all small farmers in South Africa. Cheers. To boost domestic food production and reduce reliance on imports, the Fetsatlala initiative aims to bring an additional 1 million hectares into cultivation by 2019, creating 300,000 jobs. Meanwhile, the Comprehensive Agricultural Support Program grant, which receives 1.6 billion rands per year over the medium term, aims to increase farm output, especially for the beneficiaries of land reform. Small businesses and entrepreneurship is the next area we cover. Mr. President, you have rightly reminded us that employment creation is mainly the responsibility of the private sector. And of course, the public sector plays an important part in supporting this and sometimes replacing this. I have again received many tips on the challenges faced by small and medium-sized businesses. Sharon Bosey from Pretoria suggests that government, and I quote, must offer incentives to help small businesses, end of quote. We certainly agree with Sharon. This budget allocates 6.5 billion rands over 3 years to support small and medium enterprises in South Africa. We have also accepted 2 recommendations of the Judge Davis Tax Committee, which we established, which will ease the compliance burden of small businesses. The turnover tax regime will be amended to further reduce the tax burden on micro-enterprises, and consideration is being given to replacing the graduated tax structure for small business corporations with a refundable tax compliance credit. Amendments will be made to the venture capital company tax regime, and the rules related to access to foreign capital will be eased to enhance support for entrepreneurial development. Subject to appropriate tax treatment, amendments will be made to the intellectual property rules as part of this reform. In further support of entrepreneurial development, we propose to provide tax relief to organizations involved in small enterprise development through grant making. As a complementary measure, grants received by small and medium-sized enterprises will be tax exempt, regardless of the source of their funds. Now, all of this we do in South Africa in a particular global context, and a context that, as I indicated earlier, is pretty volatile and pretty fast changing. So let me illustrate a few of those phenomena that are going on. Mr. Speaker, ultimately it is the state of the global economy and the dynamism and agility of the South African economy that shapes inclusive growth, job creation, and development. The global economy with which South Africa is connected is not yet on a path of sustained recovery. In the words of the G20 communique issued after a meeting this past weekend, and I quote, "The global economy remains far from achieving strong, sustained, and balanced growth," end of quote. Global growth gathered momentum in 2013, however, led by a recovery in some of the advanced economies. This recovery is expected to continue into 2014 to an expected 3.9% in 2015. The recovery in the United States has prompted the US Federal Reserve to taper its quantitative easing program. We have already seen considerable swings in capital flows in South Africa and indeed other emerging markets as well. Interest rates are likely to rise. Currencies will be weaker and more volatile. Growth in Europe, which is a major trading partner, remains subdued. Doubts about its banking system still remain. However, China still grows at a dynamic 7.5%, although it's not the 10 and 11% of the past, and India is expected to record 5.4% this year. Brazil remains fairly flat at 2.3%. The African continent, however, is expected to grow at around 6% a year over the next 2 years. The G20, as far as the G20 is concerned, the new global turbulence and emerging markets have created an interesting topic for debate this past weekend. The world will be a better place, Mr. Speaker, if the G20 goes back to its original mission in 2008, 2009, when it was established at a head of state, head of government level. And that mission was about all of us developing and developed, cooperating whenever either is in trouble in order to lift the prospects for global growth. If there was a greater understanding of the power of cooperative action, we would have had better results over the last 5 years or so, or last 3 years. We welcome the constructive tone emerging from the G20 meeting last weekend. We welcome the commitment to increase global output by $2 trillion and to increase jobs across the globe. Nonetheless, as a developing country, we remain concerned about the self-justifying narrative from certain quarters in the developed world. The idea that developing emerging markets are the problem, that they must get their houses in order, and that global cooperation for a more humane and sustainable future is a project for another day. For some reason, for the last 6 months or so, we've resorted suddenly to a deflection and blaming game from certain quarters. Now, interestingly, these are voices from precisely those places where huge regulatory failures led to the financial earthquake we have experienced in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. Geopolitical gamesmanship is the order of the day. Collaboration in addressing global challenges is deferred, and global statesmanship is certainly in retreat. As Africa, however, with rising prospects, building democratic institutions, expanding infrastructure, and growing trade and employment, the central priority will remain overcoming poverty and inequality through initiatives that shape our own growth path and partnerships that create our own destiny. South Africa's economic outlook is the following. As global economic growth recovers, there will be opportunities and risks for our economy as well. These developments have the potential to increase our exports. Among our emerging market partners, growth remains strong, as I indicated, but demand for mineral products, which is 50% of our exports, has moderated and is unlikely to pick up soon. The prices of our largest sources of foreign earnings remain depressed. In other words, we earn a lot of our money in South Africa by exporting our commodities. However, the rand remains an effective shock absorber against global volatility. Recent movements of the currency have been supportive of export growth while reducing the country's reliance on capital inflows. We must ensure that our fiscal and monetary choices keep inflation low and maintain the recent gains in competitiveness. While we have made significant progress in accumulating reserves, there is scope for further improvement in the years ahead. This will support the stability of our currency. We project growth to increase, as I indicated earlier, to 2.7% this year, to 3.5% in 2016. Investment is forecast to increase by about 5% a year, and the current account deficit will average 5.8% of GDP over the medium term, while consumer price inflation will return to levels within the target band between 2015 and 2016. So we must confess that that current account balance is not the right number, and that more needs to be done, either to earn foreign income or to export more, so to lower the current account deficit. Potential domestic risks to the outlook include further delays in the introduction of new infrastructure, particularly additional electricity capacity, higher inflation due to the weaknesses of the rand, and protracted labor disputes which could depress consumer and business confidence. The challenge we face, all of us as South Africa, is how do we boost growth within this kind of climate? The next phase of growth is about the dynamism, as I said earlier, and agility of the private sector, and the synergies that we can create between the private sector and government and labor. Government will continue to provide an enabling environment for businesses to grow and create employment. Over the past 5 years, we've supported businesses by relaxing exchange control regulations to support those who wanted to invest in the African continent. We provided tax incentives for manufacturing businesses to expand operations, improve competitiveness, and acquire new machinery. We also opened up opportunities for the private sector to build and run our renewable energy plants and introduced the employment tax incentive. The result was an increase in job creation. Now, this effort has to be scaled up on a much bigger scale to make a much bigger impact on growth, jobs, and development. Part of our approach is how do we remove constraints on the economy. Over the medium term, we will do the following. Add to electricity supply to improve the balance between available energy and the amounts required by businesses and households to thrive. Increase investment in economic infrastructure, including rail, water, roads, and ports. Pursue the exploration of shale gas to provide an additional energy source for our economy. Provide business support programs and special economic zones that encourage industrialization and improve local regulatory improvements, or rather improve local content. Government has also been engaging in the question of regulatory impediments and has been engaging with business on specific steps that can be taken to make it easier to do business in our country. Arising out of that process, we will now streamline regulatory and licensing approvals for environmental impact assessments, water licenses, and mining licenses. As announced by President Zuma, Parliament is finalizing amendments to give effect to this very positive development, which will cut the time it takes to start a mine from application to final approval to under 300 days under Minister Shabangu's guidance. There is further work in progress on lowering the cost structure of the economy, for example, through improved efficiencies in freight logistics. Minister Karim has published a new policy on broadband, which in due course will lead to modernization of our communications capabilities and, of course, reduce costs as well. Several cities are bringing Wi-Fi connectivity to their environs. SARS is also taking further steps to lower the cost of tax compliance in South Africa. But Africa, colleagues, honorable colleagues, also offers interesting opportunities. Investment into Africa has reached 36 billion rands a year in a range of industries. South Africa is the second largest developing country investor on the continent. In 2013, 29% of our exports were destined for Africa. In 2012, 12% of our dividends came from Africa, up from just 2% a decade earlier. Increasing these inflows will be crucial, as I said earlier, for closing the current account deficit. Foreign assets owned by South African firms are an important source of income and reduce our vulnerability to future economic downturns. In addition, 18 large African firms now have debt and equity listings on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So we are getting an exchange of business, if one likes, between African firms and South African firms. Today, further steps to simplify trade and investment with Africa are announced. The HoldCo regime, as it is called, for African and offshore operations will be extended to unlisted companies, and the limits for listed companies will be increased. This regime creates a simplified tax and foreign exchange framework for companies that trade with our fellow African countries. South Africa is an important center for financial services, such as fund and asset management. We propose a new, what is called Foreign Members Fund, which will simplify the foreign exposure rules. These funds will support South Africa as a hub for African fund management and provide a domestically regulated channel for investors to obtain foreign exposure. An equally important question for us as South Africans is how do we promote more investment in our economy and in our country? Increased investment in the economy by both the private and public sector is at the heart of creating jobs and growth. Government is committed to providing policy certainty for domestic and foreign investors. Working together with Minister Davies and the Department of Trade and Industry, a holistic framework for investment is being finalized. The framework flows from the National Development Plan, which places investment at the center of our economic growth plan. We have a number of incentives in place, which have provided substantial benefits to both foreign and domestic investors. Moreover, under the guidance of Minister Davies, a new Promotion and Protection of Investment Bill has been released for public comment. This entrenches the rights of all investors, ensuring that property rights are protected in line with our Constitution. The fiscal framework and long-term sustainability is, of course, our next challenge. Mr. Speaker, in last year's medium-term budget policy statement, we targeted revenue of 28.6% of GDP, consolidated spending of 1.2 trillion rands, and a deficit of 4.1% in 2014-15. Since then, the rand has weakened, inflation has picked up, long-term interest rates have continued to rise modestly, and the Reserve Bank has increased the repo rate by 50 basis points. These trends reinforce the need to moderate public expenditure and, more importantly, get better value for money from public expenditure, lower the budget deficit, and ensure that the public sector debt stabilizes relative to GDP. A key pillar of the current framework remains the main budget expenditure ceiling. And just to remind all of us, we agreed in Cabinet and as government that we will establish a ceiling for expenditure. Any new idea, any new project, any new undertaking must happen within the framework of the money that is available below the ceiling. Non-interest expenditure plans are unchanged over the medium term, resulting in real expenditure growth of about 2% per annum. Within the expenditure envelope, the composition begins to shift from consumption spending towards infrastructure investment. The unallocated contingency reserve amounts to 3 billion, 6 billion, and 18 billion rands over the next 3 years. Over the last decade, government spending has doubled in real terms, funding a large expansion of the social wage, which now stands at 57% of consolidated expenditure. This progress must be sustained. Our Constitution requires government to devote increasing resources to a rising flow of social and economic rights. In a period of weak economic growth, the sustainability of public finances is inevitably tested. Over the last 5 years, government has borrowed more than R1 trillion. Rising global interest rates make it increasingly costly for government to borrow. Lower commodity prices dampen the growth of revenues. A weak rand raises the price of capital goods that government needs for its investment program, while inflation raises the amount that we must pay for goods, services, and wages. These are important developments, and they're likely to last with us and stay with us for some time to come. But that doesn't mean, of course, that we get paralyzed. We have an answer to all of them. Our debt portfolio is well structured, with foreign currency denominated debt limited to about 10% of the total. Our debt markets remain highly liquid and competitive, and sometimes even the envy of many parts of the world, which means that the impact of short-term swings in capital markets can be absorbed over time. Our first Sukuk or Islamic bond will be launched this year, and this is a momentous occasion to invite new types of investors in our debt. Broader public sector sustainability is supported by a large social security fund surplus, a fully funded government employee pension system, and the improving balance sheets of state-owned companies. With these pressures in mind, government has adopted a balanced fiscal stance that continues to provide support for the economy, but charts a stronger course towards fiscal consolidation. Tax policy, the moment you've been waiting for. Savings and small business support. In 1996, Mr. Speaker, the RDP white paper stated that, and I quote, "The expansion of the South African economy will raise state revenues by expanding the tax base," end of quotation. Over the last 20 years, we have achieved exactly that. In 1994, tax revenue amounted to 114 billion rands. 114 billion rands. Revenue collected next year will exceed 1 trillion rands, 10 times more. Thanks, of course, to your tax compliance and a very efficient South African Revenue Service. This is nearly a tenfold increase in nominal terms. This was achieved while reducing the tax rate for companies from 40% in 1994 to 28%, and the top marginal rate of individuals from 45% in 1995 to 40%. I can see you hesitant because you don't know what's coming next. During this period, the contribution of corporate income tax as a proportion to total revenue has nearly doubled through better compliance and better service to corporates. We have also improved the fairness of the tax system by taxing residents on their worldwide income and taxing capital gains. These changes have brought the South African tax system more in line with international principles and have substantially broadened our tax base. Despite moderate economic growth, tax revenues have remained buoyant over the past year. Let me repeat, because there were lots of doomsayers over this past few days. Despite moderate economic growth, tax revenues have remained buoyant over the past year. What that means in simple English is that we'll collect what we targeted. In 2013-14, we'll probably collect 899 billion rands. This is 1 million more, than projected last February, and 4 billion above the estimate presented at the time of the 2013 medium-term budget statement. For the first time since the recession, corporate income tax revenues will exceed the 2008-9 peak of 165 billion rands. The main tax proposals for the 2014 budget are as follows. Your taxes go up. No. Relax. We don't want any heart attacks here. Personal income tax relief amounts to 9.25 billion rand. So that's what we're giving back to taxpayers to give relief for inflation. About 40% of this relief goes to South Africans earning below 250,000 rands per year. There is no increased tax rate for all of you. An increase in the tax-free lump sum amount paid out out of retirement funds will increase from 315,000 to 500,000 rands, benefiting especially lower income members who did not benefit from deductible contributions. Increases in excise duties, which some of you will be worried about, on alcoholic beverages and tobacco products are proposed, adding 9 cents to the price of a 340 ml can of beer and 68 cents to a packet of 20 cigarettes. For the companies that are listening, this is in line with inflation. For the whiskey drinkers in this house, whiskey goes up by 4.80 rands a bottle. And I'm afraid running out of the house to catch your last tot won't help, because these increases take effect immediately. In recognition of recent increases in the imported cost of fuel, we've also been very careful to keep the fuel levy increases at the level of inflation. The general fuel levy is limited to inflation-related 12 cents per litre and will increase on the 2nd of April 2014, and the road accident fund levy will increase by 8 cents per litre. So those are very modest increases. Legislation to allow for tax-exempt savings accounts will proceed this year to encourage household savings. Now, this is a very important new development from financial institutions, which will allow our folk to save money and not pay interest on the money, or rather not pay tax on the interest that they earn. So we hope that this will be introduced later this year. And of course, there's a limit. We can't have millionaires contributing to this. Complementing this tax reform, a new top-up retail savings bond will be introduced by the Treasury this year, allowing for regular deposits into a government retail bond. It will also be accessible to community savings groups such as Stokvels. Options for introducing a sukuk, that is Islamic retail savings bond, are also being explored. Mr. Speaker, can I urge that before we go to elections, every member here buys a retail savings bond to demonstrate that they are lending money to their government. The Income Tax Act currently requires philanthropic foundations to distribute 75% of the money they generate within a year. This requirement is unduly restrictive and will be relaxed, while ensuring that accumulated capital is distributed to worthy causes within a reasonable period. Regulatory and other measures have been put in place to address the environmental consequences of acid mine drainage. To complement current efforts and ensure that the mining sector makes its fair contribution towards continuing acid mine drainage expenses, consultations will be initiated on an appropriate funding mechanism. Following public consultations, the National Treasury and the Department of Environmental Affairs have agreed that a package of measures is needed to address climate change and to reduce emissions. This will include the proposed carbon tax, environmental regulations, renewable energy projects, and other targeted support programs. To allow for further consultation, implementation of the carbon tax is postponed by a year to 2016. Reforms to the tax treatment of the risk business of long-term insurers are also proposed. Profits from the risk business of a long-term insurer will be taxed in the corporate fund, similar to the way short-term insurers are taxed. In July last year, I appointed a tax review committee headed by Judge Dennis Davis with a broad brief to make recommendations for possible reforms. The committee's first recommendations relate, as I indicated earlier, to small and medium enterprises. These proposals will be taken forward in this budget. The committee has also started work on base erosion and profit shifting. And what that means, honorable members, is that there are many companies across the globe, and both developed countries and developing countries are suffering from this phenomenon where companies move their assumed operations and revenue to a place, let's call it that for now, or a tax haven where they pay very little or no tax. And that undermines the fiscal strength of both developed and developing countries. And these are trends that are under scrutiny internationally. During 2014, work will be undertaken on the impact of the tax system on economic growth and job creation, and aspects of VAT, mining taxes, and estate duties. As far as tax administration is concerned, Mr. Speaker, there are still great opportunities for the tax system to work for our people. In the past 5 years, the tax register of individuals grew from 5.5 million to over 15 million, to include all known economically active individuals. So businesses today supply this information twice a year, and SARS, on its database, has an up-to-date information about everybody in formal employment. Companies on the tax register now stand at more than 2.3 million. The number of employers registered for pay-as-you-earn is nearly 404,000. In the next fiscal year, SARS will implement the single registration of taxpayers and traders for the main taxes. In other words, you don't have to fill a multiplicity of forms. SARS is already working closely with other government agencies to share non-confidential, that is, non-tax electronic data. Without compromising privacy and confidentiality, this will contribute to reducing identity fraud, lowering administration costs, and enhancing compliance. This will take us a long way towards acting as a single government as far as the public is concerned. New global tax policies are being devised to counter harmful tax practices, and treaties are being designed to allow for the automatic exchange of information. You might have seen a recent case where SARS acted for the British tax authorities against a taxpayer based here but that owed taxes in Britain. Now, similar things will be done on our behalf by other tax authorities as well. So literally, for the people who are old enough here, there's no place to hide, hopefully soon. SARS currently chairs the 121-country Global Forum for Exchange of Information for tax purposes. Since the Tax Administration Act came into effect, SARS has recognized 11 bodies to which tax practitioners belong, and 15,000 tax practitioners are now registered with them. So this formalizes this sector. Taxpayers are advised to only use tax practitioners that are recognized by SARS, so that they themselves don't become victims of any scam. Over the last 2 years, the Voluntary Disclosure Program, this is where you can voluntarily come up to SARS and say, sorry, I've been naughty, I owe you X, has realized almost 5 billion rands from income that was not previously declared. As far as customs is concerned, SARS has overhauled its customs management system in August 2013. The new system is fully electronic and significantly reduces the administrative burden on importers and exporters while improving our ability to detect high-risk transactions and goods. Since its introduction, the system has processed goods to the value of 1.7 trillion rands. Border management cooperation that started during the 2010 World Cup has also significantly deepened. For example, one of the South African ports of entry is being prepared as a pilot for seamless border management across departments, which will lead to enhanced border control and trade facilitation. The one-stop border post at Lebombo will become operational shortly. Once the remaining formalities have been concluded, this will be our first one-stop border post between South Africa and an adjoining country. During 2013, about 1 billion rands worth of tobacco and cigarettes was seized from 15 non-compliant entities. 12 criminal cases are being pursued. During the same period, SARS detained 400 containers holding suspected counterfeit clothing, footwear, and textiles, and this enables us to protect South African firms. Improving the quality of public services and cutting waste is an important priority for government. Mr. Speaker, this is a budget in which circumstances dictate that we cannot add resources to the overall spending envelope. We, of course, have an expenditure ceiling. The emphasis falls, therefore, on ensuring, as I said earlier, that expenditure is allocated efficiently, enhancing management, cutting waste, and eliminating corruption. A series of initiatives are focused on these concerns, and these are not all of them. Spending reviews are underway to examine program performance and value for money conducted by the National Treasury and Minister Chabane's Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, and by provincial treasuries. What this means is that there's a selection of areas such as education and so on, where deep, if you like, audits are being done in order that we understand how the 200 billion rands that goes into education is spent and how we could spend it better and more effectively. The Office of the Accountant General has stepped up efforts to strengthen the financial control environment and has undertaken 27 forensic reviews over the past 12 months, leading to both criminal investigations and internal disciplinary action. As part of the efforts to combat waste, cost containment instructions were issued in January 2014. Budgets for consultants, travel, accommodation, and venue hire have been curtailed, and there's proof of that, which will contribute to savings over the next 3 years. So those measures that Cabinet took are in fact working. Forthcoming regulations will strengthen the National Treasury's oversight of public entities by requiring compliance with reporting requirements for expenditure, revenue, borrowing, and performance. Mr. Speaker, I referred in 2012 to an initiative to be undertaken jointly with Minister Ngesi and his department to review the validity and cost-effectiveness of all government property leases. The exercise has exposed several deficiencies, and these are just but a few. Accommodation that is unoccupied but is being paid for. Accommodation which is occupied by other entities. Discrepancies between the size of the accommodation occupied and what is actually paid for that accommodation. Marked divergences from market rates per square meter And we should all send a message to the property industry in South Africa. Why aren't you honest in the deals that you make with government? Why do we have to spend millions of rands through audit firms to discover that you are overcharging government for these facilities? And I think property owners and their organized formations owe the South African public an explanation for extracting undue money for their services. Procurement through inappropriate and non-competitive procedures, missing of invalid lease agreements and unsubstantiated payments to landlords. So money is leaving departments, but there's no substantiation as to what you're paying for. The intervention also identified a backlog of more than half of the lease portfolio that has to be reviewed. As a result of this initiative, the Department of Public Works, under the Minister, now has a turnaround strategy that will enable it to regularize the lease portfolio, while ensuring continuity of services to client departments. We now turn to procurement reforms. The Chief Procurement Office has been established and has made progress on many fronts. It will review high-value and strategic contracts to ensure that value for money is derived and that all contracts adhere to the relevant prescripts of the law. The review will contribute to efforts to ensure that government service delivery objectives are supported by the purchases of goods and services. These will include, for example, and these are examples, so this Minister Peters will know about PRASA, review of contracts such as PRASA's rolling stock tender, government leases and infrastructure projects. We'll work with Minister Gigaba and the SAA board when they get to the stage where they might want to get into fleet procurement, that we have a streamlined and proper procurement process that cannot be questioned by anyone. Development of standard lease agreements to address defects in government property transactions, standardization of infrastructure procurement processes and documentation, creation of an inspectorate to monitor procurement plans and audit tender documents. So these are people who will go out to departments, to provinces, to municipalities to check on the spot whether the right documentation is there and whether the right process has been followed. Enhanced processing of vendors' tax clearance certificates to ensure compliance. If you're not paying tax in South Africa, you shouldn't be doing business with government in South Africa. The centralized procurement of health equipment, drugs, medicines to effect savings, and the analysis of business interests of government employees. We are still remaining with a large number of employees who have a conflict of interest in respect of their position and the fact that they have a share or some interest in a business outside that's also doing business with government. That has to stop. We are also mindful of the importance of government procurement in supporting local industry and black economic development. This requires a database of South African products and black-owned businesses so that the system can foster economic empowerment and dynamically contribute to growth. And further tougher measures are being considered to enforce the rule that small businesses in particular must be paid within 30 days. Mr. Speaker, this administration has recognized the need to protect and improve the financial well-being of households, to make them less vulnerable to a sudden loss of income in bad times. We recognize that households must be encouraged to invest in their future, including investment in homes or productive assets, and saving for retirement or business purposes. South Africa has made good progress towards achieving the NDP's goal of 90% access to financial services by 2030. Some 79% of adult South Africans were using regulated financial services in 2013. Many more households have access to affordable credit, which is of great benefit when used productively, but bad when used to fund excessive consumption. Government is concerned about the level of over-indebtedness of households. including public servants. Government has therefore approved a number of measures to assist such households to reduce their debt burden and to stamp out abusive and fraudulent activities of reckless lenders and unscrupulous debt collectors. Working jointly with the Ministers of Trade and Industry and Justice, we will shortly commence actions against abusive and unsustainable practices, which includes these so-called famous garnishing orders. With regard to retirement, there will be further reforms over the period ahead. Legislation has already been passed by Parliament to improve governance over pension and provident funds and to align the rules and tax treatment of pension and provident funds, while at the same time protecting vested interests. We still seek improved coverage and preservation of retirement funds and lower costs in the system. We are currently consulting within NEDLAC on measures to cover the 6 million employed South Africans who do not enjoy access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan. We intend to move progressively towards a mandatory system of retirement savings for all employed workers. In other words, if we can't voluntarily save, then we, as the government, must help people to save by saying, give 5% of your money and save it for your future. Importantly, agreement has been reached with a body called ASISA, the Association of Savings and Investment of South Africa. These are the big insurance and asset managers of South Africa, to reduce the level of charges for retirement saving products, meaning if you've saved X thousand rands, then you must be charged a reasonable fee, and the majority of X thousand rands must come to you when you retire, not end up in charges. Mr. President, since 1994, there has been substantial progress, I submit, in transforming the lives of South African citizens. The average income of South Africans has increased by over 30% and will continue to rise in the years ahead. More than 5 million jobs have been created since 1996. Near universal school enrollment and the steady increase in average years of education for both men and women have improved the lives and life prospects of millions of South Africans. Access to basic services has grown rapidly across the country. More people than ever have access to housing, education, and services. Black participation in the economy has expanded, and there has been a transformation in the middle class. These are considerable achievements, no doubt, but they're not enough. There are still fault lines that run deep in the social fabric of our communities and our country, and tendencies in the political landscape as well. Black economic participation remains incomplete. The economy must provide many more opportunities, and the state and the private sector a lot more support to enterprises and entrepreneurs. The structure of the economy also needs to transform in order to meet the demands of a 21st century global economy and a fast-evolving continent. In some instances, governance has been weak, corruption has taken hold, and public service delivery has faltered. Puso e urtwa, dilot sa ma-Afrika borwa. Ons het gehoor, corruptie moet gestop word. I'm trying. Ma-Afrika borwa deserves better. Retitle ko tokafatsa di tirello sa puso. We are saying we've heard your pleas, and we will improve our service delivery mechanisms. That's a commitment we're making to our people. Mr. President, in your State of the Nation address, you observed that the community protests are a sign that our people want government to quicken the pace of delivery of housing, water, and sanitation, amongst other requirements. More must be done to improve management and accountability at all levels of government. The labor relations environment needs more stability. The high indebtedness of many vulnerable workers must be addressed. And going forward, these challenges are the challenges that will give future administrations focus. We know what must be changed to meet the expectations of all South Africans. Service delivery must be enhanced and supported by the necessary infrastructure. Public servants will join us in being accountable and effective. Government is committed to tackling these issues in a transparent manner with a view to building a more rapid and inclusive growth path. Mr. Speaker, on his inauguration as South Africa's first democratic president, Dr. Nelson Mandela said the following, and I quote, "Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all," end of quote. This year, nearly 1 million South Africans will celebrate their 20th birthday. You got that? Nearly 1 million South Africans will celebrate their 20th birthday. These are the first of our sons and daughters to have breathed only the clean air of a new democratic nation. These children of our freedom mark the progress we have made. In their diversity and in their dynamism and enthusiasm, in their non-racialism and in their determination with which they demand the rights of free citizens, in their optimism and fearlessness. In all this, they represent the hope that millions struggled for, and for which so many paid the ultimate price. They are a generation whose future is brighter than their parents' future could have dreamed. They are better educated, better nourished, stronger, and more resilient. But not all of them are. But they also bear the burden of the challenges we have yet to resolve. Too many will struggle to find work. Too many live in poverty and want. Like their parents, they can see the fault lines that still divide our society. They can see the gap between rich and poor. For their future, we have an obligation to begin a new and far-reaching phase of our democratic transition, a phase that calls for bold and decisive steps to replace the economy on place the economy on a qualitatively different path, to eliminate poverty and unemployment, create sustainable livelihoods, and substantially reduce inequality. The National Development Plan, honorable members, lays the foundation for fundamental transformation. It is a platform on which we need to mobilize our youth and bring together all South African citizens. Each of us has a role to play. Each of us has an obligation to meet. In conclusion, Mr. President, thank you for your...
Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan speaking to Parliament, presenting the 2014 National Budget.